The autumn of 1887 had been merciless to Jeremiah "Jeb" McKinnon, and as he stood in the doorway of his ramshackle barn, surveying what remained of his once prosperous cattle ranch, he could barely comprehend how completely his world had crumbled in the span of just 18 months. The 42-year-old rancher's weathered hands trembled slightly as he gripped the wooden doorframe, not from the cold October wind that swept across the Texas plains, but from the overwhelming weight of failure that had settled into his bones like a chronic ache. Jeb's ranch, which he had named the Double J in honor of himself and his late wife Julia, had once been home to over 800 head of prime Texas Longhorn cattle. The sprawling property encompassed nearly 3,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land in Brewster County, with natural springs that provided year-round water and grass that grew thick and green even during the driest summers. For 15 years, Jeb and Julia had built their dream together, working side by side from dawn to dusk, gradually expanding their herd and their reputation as producers of some of the finest beef in the state. Julia McKinnon had been more than just Jeb's wife. She had been his partner in every sense of the word. A small, fierce woman with auburn hair and green eyes that could flash with either laughter or determination depending on the situation, Julia had possessed an almost supernatural ability to work with cattle. She could spot a sick animal from across a pasture, predict weather changes days in advance, and somehow knew exactly when market conditions were right for selling. Jeb often said that Julia could speak to cattle in ways that he never understood, and their success had been as much due to her instincts as to his hard work. But Julia had been taken from him by consumption in the spring of 1886, and with her death, Jeb had lost not only the love of his life but also the guiding intelligence that had made their ranch successful. Grief-stricken and struggling to make decisions that had once come naturally to their partnership, Jeb had made a series of costly mistakes that had gradually eroded everything they had built together. First, he had mistimed a major cattle sale, holding onto his herd too long and missing the peak market prices by several weeks. Then came the drought of summer 1886, which lasted 4 months and forced him to buy expensive feed to keep his cattle alive. When rustlers struck in the fall, stealing nearly 200 head in a single night, Jeb had been forced to take out loans against his property just to cover his operating expenses. The winter of 1886 to 1887 had been one of the worst in memory, with blizzards that killed livestock and froze water sources for weeks at a time. Jeb had lost another 150 cattle to the cold, and the survivors were so weakened that they brought poor prices when he was finally able to sell them in the spring. By summer 1887, creditors were circling like vultures, and Jeb was forced to sell off portions of his land just to keep the bank from foreclosing on the entire property. Now, in October 1887, Jeb McKinnon owned exactly one cow. Her name was Bessie, a gentle Holstein dairy cow that Julia had insisted on keeping, despite Jeb's protests that dairy cattle had no place on a Longhorn ranch. Bessie was old now, probably 15 years if she was a day, but she still produced enough milk to keep Jeb from starving completely. She was literally the last thing of value that he owned, the final remnant of the empire he and Julia had spent 15 years building. The ranch house, once a source of pride with its wraparound porch and carefully tended flower garden, now stood as a monument to neglect and despair. The roof leaked in 3 places, the porch steps were rotting through, and weeds had completely overtaken Julia's garden. Jeb had long since sold all the furniture, except for a single bed, a kitchen table, and 2 chairs. He cooked his meager meals on a rusty wood stove and spent his evenings sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty rooms and remembering better times. His appearance reflected his circumstances. Where once he had been a robust man who took pride in his well-maintained clothes and carefully groomed beard, Jeb now looked like a scarecrow. His clothes hung loose on his diminished frame, his beard had grown wild and unkempt, and his eyes had taken on the hollow, defeated look of a man who had given up hope. He rarely bothered to shave, and his hair had gone completely grey, despite his relatively young age. On this particular morning, as Jeb performed the simple task of milking Bessie, he heard the sound of approaching wagon wheels on the dirt road that passed by his property. Visitors were rare these days. Most of his neighbors had given up trying to offer help after Jeb had made it clear that he preferred to suffer alone rather than accept charity. But as the wagon drew closer, Jeb could see that it wasn't one of his neighbors approaching. The wagon was pulled by two tired-looking mules and driven by a middle-aged woman in a faded black dress. In the back of the wagon, Jeb could see several small figures huddled under worn blankets, and as the vehicle turned into his driveway, he realized he was looking at a group of children, perhaps half a dozen of them ranging in age from maybe 5 to 12 years old. The woman driving the wagon was Sister Margaret O'Malley, though Jeb wouldn't learn her name until later. She was a Catholic nun who had devoted her life to caring for orphaned children in the aftermath of the various conflicts and disasters that had plagued Texas in recent decades. The children in her wagon were survivors of Indian raids, disease outbreaks, and family tragedies that had left them with nowhere else to go. Sister Margaret had been traveling from town to town, seeking help for her charges, but the economic difficulties that had affected ranchers like Jeb had also impacted most of the communities in the region. Town after town had turned her away, explaining that they simply didn't have the resources to help feed and house additional children. She had been traveling for 3 days without finding anyone willing or able to provide assistance, and her supplies were running dangerously low. "Excuse me, sir," Sister Margaret called out as she brought her wagon to a stop near Jeb's front porch. "I'm sorry to trouble you, but we're in desperate need of assistance." Jeb set down his milk pail and approached the wagon, his natural courtesy overriding his desire to avoid human contact. Up close, he could see that the children were in poor condition. Their clothes were tattered, their faces were gaunt from hunger, and several of them appeared to be ill. The oldest child, a boy of perhaps 12, was trying to comfort a smaller girl who was coughing violently. "What kind of assistance?" Jeb asked. Though even as he spoke, he knew he had nothing to offer. He could barely feed himself, and his own situation was desperate enough without taking on additional responsibilities. "These children are orphans," Sister Margaret explained, her Irish accent still noticeable despite years of living in Texas. "We've been traveling from town to town seeking help, but everywhere we go people say they're too poor to assist us. We haven't had a proper meal in 2 days, and several of the children are getting sick." Jeb looked at the children more carefully, seeing the desperation in their young faces. The smallest child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, was staring at him with enormous brown eyes that seemed too large for her thin face. She was clutching a piece of cloth that might once have been a doll, and her lips were cracked from dehydration. "I'm sorry," Jeb said, though the words felt like ashes in his mouth. "I wish I could help, but I'm in no position to provide assistance. I've lost my ranch, lost everything. I don't have food to spare." Sister Margaret's face fell, but she nodded with understanding. "I can see that you're facing your own hardships, sir. I'm sorry to have bothered you. We'll continue on and hope to find help elsewhere." As Sister Margaret prepared to drive away, the little girl with the brown eyes began to cry softly. It wasn't the demanding wail of a spoiled child, but the quiet, hopeless weeping of someone who had learned that crying didn't bring help, but couldn't stop the tears from coming anyway. The sound cut through Jeb's defenses like a knife, reminding him of Julia's voice telling him that no matter how bad things got for them, there was always someone worse off who needed help. "Wait!" Jeb called out, surprising himself with the word. Sister Margaret turned back, hope flickering in her tired eyes. Jeb looked at Bessie, grazing peacefully in the small paddock beside the barn. The cow represented his last asset, his final means of survival. If he sold her, he would have enough money to buy food for these children, but he would also be condemning himself to starvation. It was a choice between his own survival and the lives of innocent children, and as he stood there in the morning sun, Jeb could almost hear Julia's voice whispering in his ear. "Sister," he said slowly, "I have one cow. She's a good dairy cow, still produces milk, probably worth about $40 at the stockyard in town. If I sold her, would that be enough to buy food for these children?" Sister Margaret's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. "Sir, $40 would buy enough food to keep these children fed for weeks, but I couldn't ask you to sacrifice your only asset for strangers." "You're not asking," Jeb replied. "I'm offering. Just give me a moment to think about this." Jeb walked back to where Bessie was grazing, and the old cow looked up at him with her gentle brown eyes, almost as if she understood what he was contemplating. For the past year, Bessie had been his only companion, the only living thing that depended on him, and gave his days any structure or purpose. Milking her each morning and evening had become the only routine that connected him to his former life as a rancher. But as he looked back at the wagon full of hungry children, Jeb knew there was really no choice to be made. Julia would never have forgiven him for letting children starve while he had the means to help them, even if it meant sacrificing everything he had left. "Sister Margaret," he called out, "hitch your wagon here for a moment. I'll get Bessie ready for the journey to town." Over the next hour, Jeb prepared for what would likely be his final act as owner of the Double J Ranch. He loaded Bessie into a small cattle trailer that he hitched to his own wagon, gathered the few dollars he had in cash, and prepared to drive to the nearest town that had a livestock auction. Sister Margaret insisted on accompanying him, bringing the children along so they could see firsthand the sacrifice being made on their behalf. The journey to town took most of the morning, and during the drive, Jeb learned more about the children and their circumstances. The oldest boy, Tommy, had seen his parents killed in an Apache raid 2 years earlier, and had been living on the streets until Sister Margaret found him. The little girl with the brown eyes was named Mary, and she had been found wandering alone after her family died of cholera. Each child had a story of loss and tragedy that made Jeb's own problems seem almost trivial by comparison. At the stockyard, Jeb was offered $35 for Bessie, $5 less than he had hoped, but still enough to buy substantial food supplies. As he watched the cow being led away to join a pen full of other animals awaiting slaughter, Jeb felt a grief almost as profound as what he had experienced when Julia died. Bessie had been his last connection to his former life, and now that connection was severed forever. But as they loaded the wagon with flour, beans, salt pork, and other supplies that would keep the children fed for weeks, Jeb felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose. For the first time since Julia's death, he was doing something that she would have been proud of, something that mattered more than his own survival. Sister Margaret invited Jeb to return to the ranch with them, where she planned to set up a temporary camp, while seeking more permanent arrangements for the children. Jeb agreed, partly because he had nowhere else to go, but mostly because he found himself reluctant to part with the children, who had given him a reason to make a meaningful sacrifice. That evening, as they prepared a meal that was the first substantial food the children had eaten in days, Jeb sat on his front porch and watched the children play in his yard. Their laughter seemed to fill the empty spaces of his property with life and energy that had been missing for over a year. For the first time since Julia's death, the ranch didn't feel like a monument to failure, but like a place where good things could still happen. Tommy, the oldest boy, approached Jeb as the sun was setting, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Jeb of better times. "Mr. McKinnon," Tommy said, his voice serious despite his young age, "Sister Margaret told us what you did for us today. She said you sold your last cow so we could eat." "It was the right thing to do," Jeb replied simply. "But now what will you eat?" Tommy asked with the practical concern of a child who had learned that food didn't appear magically. "I'll figure something out," Jeb said, though he honestly had no idea what that something might be. "Maybe we could help you," Tommy suggested. "I know how to work, and some of the other kids do too. We could help you fix up your ranch." Jeb looked at the boy's earnest face and felt his heart breaking and healing at the same time. "That's a kind offer, Tommy, but I don't own this ranch anymore. The bank is going to take it away soon because I can't pay what I owe." "That doesn't seem fair," Tommy said, with the clear moral certainty that only children possess. "No," Jeb agreed, "it doesn't. But that's how the world works sometimes." That night, Jeb lay in his bed listening to the sounds of children sleeping in his front room, their quiet breathing a stark contrast to the silence that had filled his house for so many months. He thought about Julia and wondered what she would think of his decision to sacrifice Bessie for the sake of strangers. He thought about his uncertain future and the likelihood that he would soon be homeless as well as penniless. But despite the uncertainty and fear, Jeb felt more at peace than he had since Julia's death. For the first time in over a year, he had acted according to his values rather than simply surviving from day to day. He had made a choice that Julia would have been proud of, and that knowledge filled him with a warmth that had been missing from his life for far too long. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of perfect autumn weather that had always been Jeb's favorite time of year. He rose early, as was his habit, and stepped out onto his front porch to watch the sunrise. What he saw in the distance made him rub his eyes and look again, certain that he must be hallucinating. Spread across his eastern pasture, as far as the eye could see, was the largest herd of cattle Jeb had ever witnessed. There were hundreds of animals, maybe even more than 500, covering his land like a brown and white sea. They were Texas Longhorns, prime breeding stock by the look of them, and they were grazing peacefully on his property as if they belonged there. Jeb's first thought was that the cattle must have escaped from someone else's ranch and wandered onto his property during the night. But as he studied the herd more carefully, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Many of the animals bore the Double J brand that he and Julia had registered 15 years earlier, the brand that had marked their original herd before financial disaster had forced him to sell everything. Sister Margaret emerged from the house, drawn by Jeb's exclamation of surprise, and her jaw dropped when she saw the vast herd covering the pasture. "Merciful heavens," she whispered, "where did all those cattle come from?" Before Jeb could answer, he heard the sound of approaching horses and turned to see 3 riders coming up his driveway. He recognized them as neighboring ranchers: Bill Henderson, who owned the spread to the north, Carlos Mendoza, whose ranch lay to the south, and old Pete Garrison, who had been ranching in the area longer than anyone. "Morning, Jeb," Bill Henderson called out as the 3 men dismounted. "Heard about what you did yesterday, selling your last cow to feed these orphans. Word travels fast in cattle country." "How did you hear about that?" Jeb asked, confused. "Sister Margaret here sent word to the churches in 3 counties, Carlos Mendoza explained. "Asked them to pray for the man who had sacrificed everything to help children in need." The story spread from there. Old Pete Garrison, a man of few words but deep convictions, gestured toward the massive herd in the pasture. "We called in some favors, Jeb. Every rancher in a 50-mile radius contributed cattle to this herd. Some gave 5 head, some gave 50, but every man who heard your story wanted to help." Jeb stared at the 3 men in amazement. "You're telling me that all those cattle are mine?" "They're yours," Bill Henderson confirmed. "Every last one of them, along with breeding papers and bills of sale to make everything legal. We figured a man who would give up his last asset to feed hungry children deserved a chance to start over." "But I can't accept this," Jeb protested, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gift. "It's too much. Those cattle must be worth thousands of dollars." "You can and you will accept it," Carlos Mendoza said firmly. "In this country we take care of our own, especially when they've shown that they deserve help. What you did yesterday proved that you're the kind of man this territory needs." Sister Margaret was weeping openly now, her tears a mixture of joy and amazement at witnessing such an extraordinary act of community generosity. The children had emerged from the house and were staring in wonder at the massive herd that seemed to stretch to the horizon. "There's more," old Pete Garrison added. "The bank president in town heard about your situation. He's agreed to restructure your debt based on the new value of your herd. You'll be able to keep your ranch and have enough cattle to build a profitable operation again." Jeb felt his knees go weak, and he had to sit down on his porch steps to avoid falling over. In the span of less than 24 hours, he had gone from being a broken man with no future to being the owner of one of the largest cattle herds in the county. The generosity of his neighbors had not only restored his lost fortune, but had given him more cattle than he had ever owned before. "I don't know what to say," Jeb managed, his voice choked with emotion. "Don't say anything," Bill Henderson replied. "Just promise us that you'll use this second chance to build something good, and maybe keep an eye on these children until Sister Margaret can find them permanent homes." As the 3 neighbors rode away, Jeb stood in his yard surrounded by orphaned children and looked out at the magnificent herd that now grazed on his land. The cattle represented more than just financial security. They represented the restoration of his identity as a rancher and his place in a community that had rallied around him in his darkest hour. Sister Margaret approached him with little Mary, the brown-eyed girl who had touched his heart the day before. "Mr. McKinnon," Sister Margaret said, "Mary wanted to give you something." The little girl held out her hand, revealing the piece of cloth that she had been clutching since Jeb first saw her. It was indeed a doll, or rather the remains of one so worn and faded that its original appearance was impossible to determine. "This is for you," Mary said in her small voice. "Sister Margaret says you gave up everything to help us. So I want to give you something important to me." Jeb knelt down to accept the precious gift, understanding that this torn piece of cloth represented everything the little girl owned in the world. "Thank you, Mary," he said solemnly. "I'll treasure it always." Over the following weeks, as Jeb worked to organize his new herd and restore his ranch to full operation, the children became an integral part of his daily routine. Tommy proved to be remarkably helpful with the cattle, showing an instinctive understanding of animal behavior that reminded Jeb of Julia. Mary appointed herself as Jeb's shadow, following him everywhere and chattering constantly about the cattle, the ranch, and anything else that crossed her young mind. Sister Margaret remained at the ranch while she searched for permanent placements for the children, but as time passed, it became increasingly clear that the arrangement was working well for everyone involved. The children had found stability and security with Jeb, while Jeb had found the sense of family and purpose that had been missing from his life since Julia's death. 3 months after the miraculous appearance of the cattle herd, Jeb made a decision that surprised no one who had been watching the situation develop. He formally petitioned the territorial authorities to adopt all 6 of the orphaned children, making them permanent members of his family and heirs to the restored Double J Ranch. The adoption process was complicated by the fact that Jeb was a single man in a time when such arrangements were unusual, but the extraordinary circumstances of the case and the obvious affection between Jeb and the children ultimately convinced the authorities to approve the adoption. On the day the adoption papers were finalized, Jeb gathered all 6 children on his front porch and explained what it meant. "From now on," he told them, "this is your home, and I'm your father. We're going to work together to build the Double J into the finest ranch in Texas, and someday, when you're grown, it will belong to all of you." Tommy, now 13 and already showing the makings of a fine rancher, spoke for all the children when he replied, "We already knew this was our home, Papa Jeb. We've known it since the day you sold Bessie to buy us food." Years later, when Jeb McKinnon had become one of the most successful ranchers in Texas and his adopted children had grown into capable adults who helped him manage an operation that encompassed over 10,000 acres and thousands of head of cattle, people would still talk about the miraculous day when 500 cattle appeared overnight on a broken man's ranch. But Jeb knew that the real miracle hadn't been the appearance of the cattle. The real miracle had been the moment when he chose to sacrifice his last possession to help children in need, discovering in the process that sometimes the greatest wealth comes not from what we accumulate, but from what we're willing to give away for others. And on quiet evenings, when he sat on his porch watching his children work with the cattle that had restored his fortune, Jeb would sometimes take out Mary's worn doll and remember the day when a little girl's tears had reminded him that no matter how broken his life seemed, there was always someone who needed help more than he needed to protect what little he had left.